Then a rather curious thing happened. The procession was moving slowly along Fifth Avenue when suddenly a little girl in a red dress ran out from the crowd and shouted, "Oh, James, James, could I please have just a tiny taste of your marvellous peach?" "Help yourself," James shouted back. "Eat all you want. It won't keep forever anyway." No sooner had he said this than about 50 other children exploded out of the crowd and came running onto the street. "Can we have some too?" they cried. "Of course you can," James answered. "Everyone can have some." The children jumped up onto the truck and swarmed like ants all over the giant peach, eating and eating to their heart's content. And as the news of what was happening spread quickly from street to street, more and more boys and girls came running from all directions to join the feast. Soon there was a trail of children a mile long, chasing after the peach as it proceeded slowly up Fifth Avenue. Really, it was a fantastic sight. To some people it looked as though the Pied Piper of Hamelin had suddenly descended upon New York. And to James, who had never dreamed that there could be so many children as this in the world, it was the most marvellous thing that had ever happened. By the time the procession was over, the whole gigantic fruit had been completely eaten up, and only the big brown stone in the middle, licked clean and shiny by 10,000 eager little tongues, was left standing on the truck. And thus the journey ended. But the travellers lived on. Every one of them became rich and successful in the new country. The Centipede was made vice president in charge of sales of a high-class firm of boot and shoe manufacturers. The Earthworm, with his lovely pink skin, was employed by a company that made women's face creams to speak commercials on television. The Silkworm and Miss Spider, after they'd both been taught to make nylon thread instead of silk, set up a factory together and made ropes for tightrope walkers. The Glowworm became the light inside the torch on the Statue of Liberty, and thus saved a grateful city from having to pay a huge electricity bill every year. The Old Green Grasshopper became a member of the New York Symphony Orchestra, where his playing was greatly admired. The Ladybird, who'd been haunted all her life by the fear that her house was on fire and her children all gone, married the head of the fire department and lived happily ever after. And as for the enormous peach stone, it was set up permanently in a place of honour in Central Park and became a famous monument. But it was not only a famous monument, it was also a famous house. And inside the famous house there lived a famous person, James Henry Trotter himself. And all you had to do any day of the week was to go and knock upon the door, and the door would always be open to you, and you would always be asked to come inside and see the famous room where James had first met his friends. And sometimes, if you were very lucky, you would find the Old Green Grasshopper in there as well, resting peacefully in a chair before the fire, or perhaps it would be the Ladybird who had dropped in for a cup of tea and a gossip, or the Centipede to show off a new batch of particularly elegant boots that he had just acquired. Every day of the week, hundreds and hundreds of children from far and near came pouring into the city to see the marvellous peach stone in the park. And James Henry Trotter, who once, if you remember, had been the saddest and loneliest little boy that you could find, now had all the friends and playmates in the world. And because so many of them were always begging him to tell and tell again the story of his adventures on the peach, he thought it would be nice if one day he sat down and wrote it as a book. So he did. And that is what you've just finished listening to. This audiobook was produced and published by Penguin Books Limited.